Welcome everybody. I'm Brian O'Leary with the Book Industry Study Group, and thank you for coming to today's webinar, A Pandemic of Meetings, which is a Linda Secondari design thinking webinar presented by Linda Secondari. Linda is the founder and principal of Studio Secondari. Linda is also an active member of our BISG and our workflow committee. Several months ago, in planning some of the thinking that we had for workflow webinars during the course of the year, Linda suggested this idea, which she'd been working on in her own mind for a while, to just talk about ways to reduce, reconsider, and refine your meetings. She's promised that if you can implement some of the things that she's recommending today, you can save up to about 15% of the time you currently dedicate to meetings. And we teased her yesterday that with this webinar, there is a money-back guarantee. Linda, thank you very much for both preparing this and for presenting it today. Welcome to the webinar, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm so very excited to be talking with everyone. So thank you for making time. And for those of you who are watching on recording, thank you for making time for this, what I think is important content. So I'd like to welcome everyone to A Pandemic of Meetings. I kind of use that term, playfully, a pandemic of meetings, sort of like a murder of crows, but also a double entendre because we've all lived through what I think is a pandemic of meetings. So I'm just excited to have all of you here, and I've got a lot of good information to cover, and I'm excited to get us started. But I'd also like to make sure that we keep the chat nice and lively. So why don't people type in where you're joining us from? I live in New York City, but to be completely honest right now, I'm joining you from the woods of northeastern New York. And that just seems like such a pandemic kind of hybrid working from home situation. And you'll just have to forgive me if you overhear some kids and dogs or power tools, but I'll do the best to talk over the din. Another also pandemic thing is that I've recently had COVID, and although I'm feeling really fine, I do have a bit of chest congestion. So forgive me if I sound a little winded or start to cough, but we'll get through it. And next slide. Okay, sorry, give me a sec. Okay. So my name is Linda Secondari, and I am a recovering meeting scheduler. I felt really compelled to give this webinar because I've experienced what I believe all of you must be experiencing, and that is meeting overload. I want to let you know that help is here, and I'm going to share with you some tools and approaches and techniques that will help you pare down your meeting schedule. The irony of having a webinar about meetings is not lost on me. I recognize it and I own it. Trust me, you will be grateful that you invested some time in learning how to break the cycle of meeting overwhelm. The most important thing to recognize is that time is our most limited resource. Everyone's time is precious. In business, we can hire more people, we can make more money, but the time we have is all the time we have. And it's because time is such a valuable and rare commodity that I want to share what I've learned about managing meeting time with all of you. By the way, I'd love to know what your motivation is for attending the webinar. So maybe you could put that in the chat as well. This is the plan for the next hour. In this webinar, you're going to learn how to audit the meetings you have to determine if you need them. You'll also learn about alternatives to meetings and what tools and working styles can be employed to replace meetings. And finally, you'll learn how to make a meeting a true meeting of the minds. If you absolutely have to have a meeting, then make the most of it in terms of time and engagement. We've got a lot to cover, and I want to dive in. But before I go any further, a little housekeeping. I'm planning on ending this meeting early because that's one of my best practices for meetings. I'm also going to allow some time for questions at the end. I have a lot of content to share, but I am a fast talker, and with any luck, we will fit everything in. I'm eager to make this as engaging an experience as possible, so we're going to have some surveys for all of you to answer. And I'd also like you guys to use the chat to keep the conversation going. So, and Brian will keep me informed as to what's being said in the chat. Is there anything exciting happening in the chat yet, Brian?
Well, Linda, we already have at least 2 folks calling in from Europe. So the pandemic of meetings is apparently a challenge, not just in the US or North America, but around the world.
Welcome. Yes, I believe so. I think it's a global challenge. So this is a recent Wall Street Journal a blurb from one of their articles. And the part that really strikes me is that we're spending more than half of our work weeks in meetings. And that just seems astounding. And even more, it's an increase of over 7 hours a week. So that begs the question, to meet or not to meet. Meetings are an essential aspect of our professional lives. I have this cute story that I'll tell you. When my daughter Stella, now she's about to go to college this fall, so this is an old story. When she was about 3 years old, I heard her telling her dolls that they were going to have a grown-up party with all the things that grown-ups like: beer, tools, and meetings. So I laughed because that's really funny. But clearly Stella had overheard her dad and I talking often about our various meetings, and surely something that grown-ups did that often must be fun. And as this story is more than 15 years old, I realize this is not a new problem, but I do know that it has gotten significantly worse since the pandemic. With all of us being so overscheduled, how are we supposed to get any work done? Some people try to multitask during all of these meetings, checking email and reading material unrelated to the meeting that they're attending. But that's a waste of everybody's time, and surely there is a better way. If you want to get some of your productive hours back, the first thing you should do is evaluate the meetings you currently have by conducting a meeting audit. Start by considering the types of meetings that you have scheduled. I've identified 3 basic types of meetings. There's the informational meeting, decision-making, and collaborative meetings. Let's take a minute to go over each of these meeting types individually. You could say that all meetings are information sharing meetings, but what I'm referring to here are status meetings, one-on-one, or update meetings. Most of the time, the information sharing meeting can be eliminated or its frequency can be reduced. So if you have a weekly catch-up, consider reducing the frequency to bi-weekly or once a month. The reason that this is possible is that the type of information that's shared during these information sharing meetings tends to be the type of information that can be efficiently shared through a report, a dashboard type status tracker, or some other form of asynchronous communication. When I think back at my time at Oxford University Press, I managed a very large international team of 45 designers and art directors. And I realized that I actually wasted a lot of time having weekly one-on-ones with my direct reports. At the time, I didn't feel like I was wasting time. I thought I was doing what I needed to do to keep in touch with my staff, giving them my individual attention. But in fact, we could have met less frequently, but with more intention if we had dispensed with the status aspect of our catch-ups and focused only on the problem solving and mentorship content. So now another type of meeting is decision-making meetings. And these are pretty much what they sound like, meetings that are where informed participants need to hash out details and arrive at a consensus. And although decision-making meetings definitely benefit from real-time engagement, any preliminary informational exchange can almost always be handled asynchronously. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Finally, collaborative meetings. Again, these are what they sound like, a meeting where participants collaborate and develop something. These meetings benefit from real-time engagement of the participants, either virtually or in person. But like decision-making meetings, advanced prep work can be done asynchronously to keep the meeting time shorter. Some meetings are a combination of two or more of these meeting types, but all meetings have at their core one of these three intentions. Can you write in the chat which of these meeting types appear most often in your calendar? So now back to conducting the meeting audit. Now that you know about the three types of meetings, you're ready to conduct the audit. A meeting audit is a surefire method to eliminate or reduce the frequency of meetings. To conduct the audit, look at all the meetings you have scheduled over the course of 1 month. Once you've done that review, ask the following questions about each meeting. Brian, do we have any responses to the meeting types question?
Folks have just started to weigh in. I had added that at BISG, most of our meetings are collaborative, which is probably your experience with us as well.
Definitely, yeah. So to conduct the meeting audit, start by saying, what type of meeting is this? In fact, what I would do is I would make a list on a piece of paper with 3 column headings. Each column has a different meeting type as the heading, and then just jot down under each column what type of meeting you have for every day. So on Monday, I have a status meeting, I have an information gathering meeting, I have a collaborative meeting, and then look at the whole month in terms of how they plot out in these columns. And I think that'll be fairly revelatory in terms of how many meetings you probably could reconsider, revise, or reduce the frequency of. Another question to ask is, does this meeting have a goal or a desired outcome? So now we're going to have our first survey question of the webinar. I'd like to know what percentage of meetings you attend have a clear goal stated with the invite. I'll give you guys a minute or so to do that. So continuing with the meeting audit, next you'll ask yourself, does moving forward on this topic require real-time engagement from all the participants? Oops, sorry. Okay. Is the matter time sensitive? Is the subject matter complex with lots of moving parts? Is the meeting goal worth spending the time and money to have this meeting? If the answer to most of these questions is yes, then by all means have the meeting. If the answer to most of these questions is no, then consider what alternatives to meetings you might be able to employ. Brian, do we have the survey results? Interesting. So it looks like the majority have very few meetings with stated goals, but some, good for you who have most of your meetings with stated goals, you're already very well on the right track.
But I think this kind of underlines the point that you've been making, which is that quite a few meetings are pulled together without necessarily a clear stated goal or a purpose for those who are attending.
Exactly. So I've developed this decision map to help you conduct your meeting audit. At the end of this session, I'll provide you with a link to my website where you can download a copy of the decision map for yourself. And I would really encourage you to, print it out and put it on your wall, if only as a reminder that you should think twice about scheduling that meeting or even accepting to attend a meeting. And I would really encourage you to take some time to do a thorough meeting audit and use the decision map to help you identify the meeting type and then see if the meeting is necessary. So the decision map looks cute, but it actually does work. And again, my goal in developing the decision map is to help get you into the mind frame where you will question if a meeting is necessary. Here's a close-up of the map, and you'll see that the first question is, does this meeting have goals and an agenda? We'll discuss this more on, but spoiler alert, Having goals and an agenda for a meeting is one of the best tools to ensuring a successful meeting. So this is a great tip. Designating one day a week to be a meeting-free zone is a great way to ensure that you have some productive time during the week. And for those of you who have the challenge of managing up around meetings, meaning that you get invited to meetings, but maybe you're not the one scheduling them, this is an idea that can be floated to higher ups in an organization as a way to support productivity and creativity. And it may be a softer way to broach the topic of fewer meetings. If you need more tips on managing up around this topic, please feel free to reach out to me. Anything interesting happening in the chat?
It's been a little bit quiet, but I think that the folks will probably warm up over time.
Okay. So part 2 of our session, talking out of sync. We've established that we need to be meeting less for a host of reasons, but how can we keep projects moving forward without meetings? How can we accomplish everything that needs to be done, like the communication that takes place in meetings, without having meetings drain our work schedules? Part of the solution might come from asynchronous communication. Asynchronous what? Before defining asynchronous communication, I'm going to start by defining synchronous communication. Synchronous communication is what we do all the time. It takes place in real time between 2 or more people. It's a live conversation. This is the kind of communication that happens in meetings, but also when you bump into people on the street, when you order something at Starbucks, that's all synchronous. Alternatively, asynchronous communication is a type of communication where one person provides the information, then there's a delay before the recipient takes in the information and provides a response. There are benefits to both kinds of communication, but I think it's safe to say that as a culture, we lean heavily on synchronous over asynchronous communication, which results in, wait for it, a lot of meetings. Using async forms of communication is actually genius, especially now that we're working more in a hybrid work culture where not everyone is in the same location, working at the same time, or even in the same time zone. Meetings, also known as synchronous communication, require that everyone be available and present at the same time. Async communication allows team members to decide when they're best able to address that type of work. It allows people to take as much time as they need to formulate an opinion or to answer a question. Asynchronous communication also evens out the in-house bias weighed against remote staff, especially those in different time zones. So this is a great quote, and I like the point that Javier is making here, that we need to reconsider what work needs to be done in real time versus what work needs to be done, can be done asynchronously. This is a new way of thinking about work, and it won't necessarily come naturally to everybody, but it is definitely worth exploring. So how do you implement an asynchronous way of working? We already use many of the tools of asynchronous communication in our synchronous lives. So moving to a partially asynchronous communication flow doesn't require learning any new ways of working, which means that it's relatively easy to implement and cost-effective as well. If you'd like to implement more async in your work life, try video. Sometimes it's just easier to show someone how to do something. And it's so easy to record yourself, your screen, or both you and your screen, either using Zoom or Teams, or there's a myriad of other video recording applications. And I do this with my own assistant. If I'm trying to explain something, I'll just do a quick video. I can use my cursor to show her what I'm pointing to, or I can write some notes. And it's like we had a meeting, but she can look at it whenever she is ready to or able to. Similarly, screenshots. Sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words. And instead of sending an email about a specific task or issue, it might be easier or more helpful to capture a screenshot and just mark it up. Surveys are also a fast way to capture honest, actionable feedback from your team. If you need to get feedback, put a survey out there. and there are so many free options available. Direct messaging, which I know we all use a lot, but thinking about this as an aspect of asynchronous workflow and maybe dedicating channels or certain hashtags so that it's easier to sort of go through all of the Slack, Chatter, or whatever direct messaging tool you happen to use, also helps gather that content and make it easily discoverable. Creating a knowledge base is as easy as sharing a document with information links on it, and team members can refer to the knowledge base to answer simple questions or catch up on what they've missed. But as with everything in life, it's best to be prepared for unexpected issues. Creating an emergency communication protocol that alerts team members when urgent matters require immediate attention and a response cannot be delayed is really critical. An emergency protocol can be as easy as flagging a message or using a code word to designate a high priority communication. That way, if an emergency pops up and you need immediate attention, you can just flag it or use the code word, and they know that they need to respond as quickly as possible. I wonder if anyone in the audience uses any other forms of Slack, of asynchronous communication, and if so, please put them in the chat. So hopefully now you've got a clearer view of how asynchronous communication can be employed in your work culture to reduce the dependence on synchronous communication and meetings. I'm sure you can envision tons of applications for asynchronous communication in your everyday. Having asynchronous tools in your toolbox can allow you to keep the work flowing without actually needing to have an in real-time conversation. And remember that having time to consider an issue before responding is a gift that rewards the sender and the receiver. So, which async tools do you think you could use to reduce the number of meetings? That's our next survey question.
Linda, this is actually a multiple choice. So if folks are using, say, video and screenshots, you can click on both and we'll get a response.
Thank you. Okay, so just to keep things moving while the survey is happening, this is a list of the meetings that can be done asynchronously and effectively. And I would just like to highlight for everyone the last item on the list, which I have helpfully highlighted in red to make it very visible. A great way to use asynchronous working methods, even in a designated synchronous meeting, like a collaborative meeting where it's understood that people need to meet at the same time, is to provide the materials in advance so that all the attendees can prepare in their own time and then meet solely for the purpose of the collaboration. This will shorten those meetings considerably. This respects different ways of working as well as schedule constraints. How's the survey coming, Brian?
It's pretty good. I can share the results if you'd like. And also I'd like to, while I'm doing that, bring in a comment from Roxanne who added to the chat that her experience that at times asynchronous communication, like a direct message, happens at the same time as a synchronous meeting, which in her experience can create more meetings. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, we want to value the time, everybody's time. So if we're in a meeting, we should be in the meeting. We shouldn't be reading emails. We shouldn't be reading something that we're preparing for another meeting. And I don't think it's valuable to be sort of texting each other while the meeting's happening, because it's distracting and it can, as Roxanne says, it can lead to either confusion or need for a follow-up. So I guess my goal is for us to really look at our schedules, and if we've committed to a meeting, commit to being there and having an intention in that meeting. And I believe that if the goal for the meeting is described, and I'm going to go into very soon, next slide, I'm going to start talking about all of the ways to make a meeting really useful and purposeful. but if you follow that, and like I said, commit to being in the meeting, more successfully, you're using your time more successfully, and you're respecting the time of everybody else who's in the meeting. So I feel your pain, Roxanne.
You're seeing in the responses, the top responses for asynchronous tools that people have used are direct messaging and screenshots, followed by the knowledge base.
Yeah, yeah. So that's good. It's great. So as I said, these asynchronous tools are tools that we all already have. And that's what makes integrating them into your workflow, perhaps using them in a slightly different way, easier, because we already have the tools, we know how to use them, and we're comfortable with them. Now the question is how to integrate them so that they can eliminate aspects of the work that's done in meetings. So I think everyone on this webinar is already well on their way to being able to deploy asynchronous communications. All right, so now let's remember that the goal is not to have no meetings, it's to have the right kind of meetings, meetings that are effective and efficient, meetings with the right people invited who are engaged and up to date on the information being discussed. Meetings comprised of a diverse audience in varying perspectives and capabilities who can work together, but also can disagree, discuss, change minds, and move forward towards a successful outcome. A good meeting respects the time and resources it is using and makes the most of the time we have. So the question is, what are the steps to having a great meeting? A meeting that is actually a meeting of the minds. Okay, so Brian has left the building, but when he comes back, he will put a link to this really great, oh, maybe I'm jumping ahead, never mind. Okay, so this is a great quote. And I think it's astounding that 4 whole days a month are lost to ineffective meetings. So what makes a meeting ineffective? Now, this is going to be tedious because we all sort of know the answer, but based on statistics, it bears repeating. Ineffective meetings are meetings that are not well thought out at the onset. I'm going to explain this further in the next slides, but I think it's just worth sitting with that thought for a minute. Setting up a meeting can be a knee-jerk reaction, and it shouldn't be. A meeting needs to be planned and considered. Just doing that would make your meetings more effective. Let's see what we can do to make our meetings more effective. A good meeting will center on a productive discussion with a clear purpose. Begin planning the meeting with the end of the meeting in mind. Understand your desired outcome so that you can tell your invitees. And when I say desired outcome, I don't mean like a foregone conclusion desired outcome. I mean, a resolution will be made to X issue, and then the meeting will take care of what that resolution is, just to be clear. Envision your attendees and develop the meeting like you're telling them a story. Take them from the beginning to the middle to the end. Build your agenda based on that exercise. Make sure the content is relevant to them and that the attendees have something to offer the meeting or will be able to learn something at the meeting. This is a good time to determine what information needs to be shared before the meeting so that everyone attending is informed and can make the best use of their time together. Meetings are expensive, so be thoughtful about who you invite. You want to invite the minimum number of people needed to achieve your goal, but you also want a group that brings a diverse perspective and knowledge, especially if the purpose of the meeting is decision-making or brainstorming. This is the link that I was referring to earlier. So Brian, this is the Harvard Business Review link. They have a great tool, and you can use it to see how expensive a meeting is going to be. And you give information in terms of the number of attendees, some sort of salary ranges, and then it tells you how much the meeting is going to cost you or the business. And it's pretty revelatory.
And Linda, we've added that to the chat.
Thank you. So step 3 is imagine your audience. think about the specific attendees, or if it's a very big group, create personas, the cool kids in the back, the engaged overachievers, the distracted managers. How can you capture their attention and engagement? Also think about, is your meeting comprised of introverts or extroverts? Probably a mixture of both. Offer opportunities for the introverts to familiarize themselves with the content in advance, and also keep the extroverts from claiming all the airtime during the meeting. In-house versus virtual. To balance the potential for in-house bias if the group is unevenly split between virtual and in-house attendees, a good rule of thumb is that if there are fewer virtual attendees, it's likely more productive for everyone to log in virtually. Time of day. Again, there can be an in-house bias if attendees are streaming in from a variety of time zones. The disconnect between engaged morning attendees and exhausted afternoon attendees, or even anyone attending during non-standard working hours, can affect the meeting performance. So keep this in mind when preparing the agenda, and consider alternating between time slots to even out the burden. Also keep in mind that the need for facilitation, which increases with the number of people in a meeting. Someone has to manage the conversation. So I've been saying this throughout, but it really does save time to provide materials before the meeting so that folks can familiarize themselves with the content. This ensures that the meeting goal can be accomplished in the least amount of time. If you get the meeting started right, it's essential to share the agenda beforehand. If you don't have an agenda finalized in time, attach to the invite. Be sure to be clear about the intention of the meeting at the very least, and why the attendees are being invited. Let them know that they will be receiving the agenda and meeting materials in advance, and that they should be prepared to familiarize themselves with everything in advance of the meeting. Try to send the agenda at least 2 working days before the meeting. So this is a great tip. Capture all open questions and follow up by having an agenda item to do so at the end of the meeting. That way you don't get rushed and forget to do that, because capturing this content is really critical, because this is what you've had the meeting for. So I'm going to reiterate that. A meeting without a record of what transpired and what was agreed is a complete waste of time. If one thing can stay with you today, it should be the critical importance of an agenda and meeting minutes, which is actually 2 things, but critically important nonetheless. So again, this is one of those things that almost doesn't need to be said, but apparently it does need to be said because folks aren't doing it based on the data. Action items are critical to progress and getting stuff done. Make sure that action items are captured and that someone is responsible. And then, and this is really just as important as capturing the action items in the first place, at the subsequent meeting, be sure to review progress against the action items. And that's the way to keep things moving. End a meeting on a positive note. Be grateful for the time and effort of everyone who's attending, and try to end a little early so that everyone has a few moments to review their notes before moving on. Attendees remember a meeting that ended positively more and are more apt to follow up. So now this is the last survey question. What percentage of your meetings result in minutes and action items? After that, after you answer this, we'll move on to some questions.
And Linda, while we're fielding the poll, 2 folks, Edson and Kara, made the observation. Edson saying meetings do allow for chit chat and water cooler talk, which is an important component of social. Is there a way to do that without necessarily having a meeting? And Kara, kind of seconding it, said in their permanent work from home environment, there is a need for casual check-ins to keep relationships and culture healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have thoughts? And I know you voiced some of these at one of our workflow committee meetings.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's great when a meeting can start with some casual chit chat. And so as whomever is in charge of the meeting agenda might allow if it's an all virtual team, might allow for a bit more time at the beginning as people start dribbling in. There are also, really great exercises, icebreakers, games that you can play to kind of replicate that. Again, during the meeting, you can schedule it, or you could have a dedicated get together. But I think it's a nice way to begin a meeting, especially if everyone doesn't know each other as well, or if there's been a lot of time and distance between everyone. So I agree that we do miss out on that social aspect, but I do believe that we can replicate it. So wow, we're kind of evenly split. So that's interesting. And again, well done, those of you who have most of your meetings with minutes and action items, because that's a good use of your time then. And the very few in the sum, there's some room for progress. And so I guess it was good that you came to this meeting in the first place. So I want to mention that if you found this information useful, Brian will be sending out a survey to capture feedback. But I'd also love it if you'd reach out to me directly. My email is linda@studiolosecondari.com, or you can schedule a quick chat with me if you'd like. There's a scheduling app on my website, and you can either use the QR code to get there on your phone, or go to studiolosecondari.com. And I also wanted to mention that I encourage you to download the decision map and post it on your wall as a reminder about meetings. And again, you can either go directly to that URL or take a picture of the QR code, and it'll take you directly to that page, and there's just a download. And while you're there, if you want to look around or sign up for my newsletter, that would be groovy. So now we're open for questions.
And Linda, I just wanted to mention that we did provide a link to the decision map as well, a direct link in the chat, so that there are multiple ways for people to access it.
Great, thank you.
We don't have any direct questions yet, but I had a couple. I mean, you've heard a couple already, and folks have put it in the chat. But you mentioned in one instance the tools that might be useful for creating asynchronous communication using video on Zoom, Loom, and Vidyard. I think are the three examples you get. How do you, as a person interested in this topic, how do you keep up with these tools? I mean, I got to imagine that there's something new every week.
There is something new every week. Well, I belong to several organizational design groups, so I get a lot of great information and instruction through those groups. I think the Harvard Business Review, I have a subscription. They generally have, at least once a year, if not a few times a year, nice overview of different tools, and they've done a really wonderful job of trying to keep on top of technology as everyone, had to transition kind of so violently into virtual. They were super supportive with the information. I know that you have to have a subscription to that, but I think they have really good information. And LinkedIn, I mean, there's so many people curating wonderful content. It's, almost overwhelming. But those are the three methods that I use the most.
And I think that probably is very much the case that you have to rely on those kinds of resources, whether it's a trade association relevant to your business or somebody who's already collecting this information, because it would be a full-time job probably just to keep up with tools and resources.
Yeah. And things, not everything lasts. So I think it is good to let someone kick it around the block before you get too attached to it, and then it goes belly up. So.
You didn't say, I think you mentioned in passing in a similar way, Slack. Do you have a point of view on the use of Slack as an asynchronous tool? I mean, because some folks find it particularly invasive, others a real benefit.
Well, I personally use Slack with in my own business with my staff and with any contractors we're working with. Also, a number of organizations that I'm on the board of, we use the Slack channel. So I'm comfortable with Slack. I think the problem with anything email, Slack, texts is it's hard. There's no index. Slack has a fairly decent search function, but it's not great because you do accumulate so much content in it. So I really like a knowledge base. I like the combination of Slack plus a knowledge base. And I will just start a Google Doc for a topic or a project. And as people are posting links in Slack, the ones that are important, I'll take and I'll put them in the knowledge base just to sort of curate it and organize it. You can index, a Google Doc. You can have hot links to get you to different parts of the document. So it's just easier to navigate. But I like the intimacy of Slack, the immediacy of it, as opposed to email. It feels a little more like you're talking over the cubicle wall to the person next to you than email does. And that's really just psychological. I mean, that's just perspective. There's no real significant difference. But I think Slack can be incorporated nicely into an asynchronous workflow. I'm not hearing you. I think, are you muted?
Sorry about that. The Airedale decided to get loud for a moment. This may reflect only my own experience, but in using Slack and similar asynchronous tools. But sometimes people have an expectation that if they put it on Slack, that I will answer it in an immediate time frame, and that kind of takes away from the asynchronous nature of it. And so I think, much as you wouldn't necessarily just pop your head over the cubicle and immediately interrupt somebody who you didn't know well, who was in the middle of something, yeah, there has to be some sort of Slack etiquette developed, or Slack norms, perhaps.
Yeah, and I do believe that all of these, if you're going to implement any kind of a workflow, you do have to communicate your expectations around it and agree with your team how it's going to be used, which is why I have that emergency kind of flag that, if it's understood that Slack is asynchronous and people will get to it when they can, you need to have that flag if you want some urgency, or do an @channel where they're going to get pinged. Whereas you can just put the other messages without the @whoever, and they can look at them whenever they want. At least that's how I work.
Those are good examples of, I guess, Slack norms or something like that. Morton, when you asked the question about, what do your meetings look like when you look across a month, had said that most of his meetings are informational in nature. What do you do? Because you've already made the case that informational meetings are probably the most likely to not need an in-person conversation. How do you move an organization if you're seeing that? What do you do next to kind of, I think you've identified good best practices, but you also have to change other people within the company.
Right. So, I mean, I think it depends on where you are in the company. So, I just briefly mentioned in terms of managing up. If you're someone who just gets invited to a lot of meetings, you're not perpetrating the meetings on anybody else. One of a nice entree is to talk to your, manager and say, would you consider looking at a meeting free day? Productivity, and you can support that. And again, I'd be happy to, if anyone has these challenges, I'd be happy to, talk to them and give them a little coaching on how to have this conversation. But you can point to some really good data about the benefits of a meeting free day. That way you're not kind of pointing to any one meeting. Again, this is if you're, not at an upper level, you're not pointing to any meeting, you're just saying, as a practice, let's consider. So I think that's a kind of a really good entree. Another way to do it would be to, look at these meetings and then maybe say, like, I've been reading that perhaps this kind of a meeting, here's a report. I feel like I can give this to you weekly, and then maybe we can try to meet bi-weekly and see how that goes over. But so much depends on the person and the business. It's kind of hard for me to give like an overarching answer to anybody, but I would be more than happy to chat with people if they're having some challenges.
Great, thank you. And I think that the resource that you provided, the estimate the cost of the meeting calculator from Harvard Business Review, might be another way. So somebody could just simply say, look, I read this, I did some back of the envelope calculations, and it looks like we're, spending this much money on either on this regular meeting or on this set of meetings.
Yeah.
And not to say, and we should do this, but rather just what can we do to better manage that?
Yeah. And I mean, as I said, my own experience managing a large and distributed staff was, I felt like I should be spending time with each of them individually every week, that I was obligated to do that. Whereas now in hindsight, I realized they probably were, dreading those meetings. And I wish that someone had said, like, hey, maybe we could do this once a month. And if we weren't doing all of that updating part, we really could just focus that time on the, problem solving, mentorship, the issues that really do benefit from having that in real-time conversation.
I mean, you're giving me a lot to think about. Obviously, BISG is dedicating a significant share of its resources to managing its 5 standing committees as well as occasional working groups. I think many of our practices kind of fit into the bucket of what you've recommended, but I don't know that we've done everything. And so maybe there are opportunities to either tighten agendas or ask questions more pointedly throughout the meetings.
I think everyone can always improve their game,
The Morton added after I'd asked the question related to his observation to thank you for your thoughts on the information heavy meeting. Have you seen examples of companies that have kind of changed, or even departments that have changed their approach to this and delivered significantly better outcomes for at least the same amount, if not fewer meetings or fewer hours dedicated to meetings?
I have this content is something that I've really just begun espousing in January. Although I will say that at OUP, I was part of a workforce that was established to help with meeting protocols, not so much to eliminate meetings, because asynchronous really wasn't where we were thinking. This was 6-7 years ago, but to develop a protocol for having a good meeting. And I know that even based on that we greatly improved just the productivity of meetings, and we certainly had a lot, and I know they continue to have a lot, but in terms of eliminating meetings, other than data points that I've seen, I can't speak specifically to that.
Great.
Yet, but I'm working on that.
Certainly some of the data that you shared, I think from the Wall Street Journal at the beginning, that the average work week is now more than half consumed by meetings. And that's an increase. Did you say 7 hours?
Yeah.
Yeah, so 50% from 14 to 21 hours a week over the course of the pandemic.
And it's understandable, because I think people, felt that they needed to have more, even if it was over Zoom, they needed to have more connection. But my point is, I think now we need to step back and realize that everything, the way we work has changed, and we need to question all assumptions.
I think that's a really important point. And I think you've given folks at least some of the tools that are necessary, and we'll have to do more work both at BISG and probably across the industry to get people to be thinking clearly about the purpose of meetings and articulating both what we expect and then what we actually achieved. which seem to be core components of how we effectively use in-person time, synchronous meetings.
Mhm.
Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, number one, I'm happy to see that we're going to wrap up a little early because I do think that that's always a good thing to do when you can. No, I just want to thank everyone for their time, and I hope that they feel this was a good investment of their time. I, take that seriously. I try to practice what I preach, and please do be in touch and download the decision map and print it out and put it on your wall so that you'll remember to question whether or not you have a meeting. So thank you so much, Brian, for the opportunity and everybody's time.
Well, thank you for doing this. And I want to let everybody know that we put a link a couple times into the chat toward the end of the chat to link to the survey. We'll be sending that same link out in a follow-up email that will include a link to the recording for this webinar, which will be available in a couple of days. And you're welcome to refer your friends as well, and anyone else who might have missed this meeting to hear it, and also to reach out to Linda as a resource for somehow ending or at least managing the impact of this pandemic of meetings. Thank you.
Great.
And thanks everyone for being here today.